Pharmakia is a false hope and a deception of false peace, false healing, and a false future. Hello there, my name is Dr. K. Paul Stoller, and the video you're about to watch is based on my perspective, The Great Democide, which was published in a peer-reviewed journal. This is Part 1. The Armenian genocide was not a mistake. Holodomor was not a mistake. The final solution was not a mistake. The killing fields was not a mistake. The Great Leap Forward was not a mistake. Name your genocide, it was not a mistake. That includes the Great Democide of the 2020s. To imply otherwise is to give them the out they are seeking. It was not botched. It was not bungled. It was not a blunder. It was not incompetence. It was not lack of knowledge. It was not spontaneous mass hysteria. The planning occurred in plain sight. The planning is still occurring in plain sight. The philanthropaths bought the science. The modelers projected the lies. Testers concocted the crisis. The NGOs leased the academics. The scientists fabricated the findings. The mouthpieces spewed the talking points. The organizations declared the emergency. The governments erected the walls. The departments rewrote the rules. The governors quashed the rights. The politicians passed the laws. The bankers installed the control grid. The stooges ordered the money. The Department of Defense placed the orders. The corporations fulfilled their contracts. The regulators approved of the solution. The laws shielded the contractors. The agencies ignored the signals. The behemoths consolidated the media. The psychologists crafted the messaging. The propagandists chanted the slogans. The fact chokers smeared the dissidents. The censors silenced the questioners. Jackboots stomped the dissenters. The tyrants summoned. The puppeteers jerked. The puppets danced. The colluders implemented. The doctors ordered. The hospitals administered. The menticide is scripted. The bamboozled followed. The totalitarianized bullied. The Covidians tattled. The parents surrendered. The good citizens believed and forgot. This was calculated. This was formulated. This was focus grouped. This was articulated. This was manufactured. This was falsified. This was coerced. This was invective. This was denied. We were terrorized. We were isolated. We were gaslit. We were dehumanized. We were wounded. We were killed. Don't let them get away with it. Don't let them get away with it. Don't let them get away with it. A poem by Margaret Anna Alice. The world now knows emails between CDC managers, Dr. Fauci, Dr. Collins, and the White House NIH HHS that they all knew about vaccine-induced myocarditis and thrombotic thrombocytopenia in early 2021, despite over 80% of the emails were redacted. Every American citizen must be given access to this complete set of unredacted communications. And the guilty must be prosecuted in a special court arranged by the victims' families. We are still in the midst of the greatest worldwide psychological operation, PSYOP, in the history of man. Not that long ago, we were hunter-gatherers, where family, purpose, cooperation, and community were paramount to survival. We were never wired to withstand the level of psychological manipulation we have been experiencing, the purpose of which was to invert reality so we could easily be led to slaughter. It has split our realities, and now we have two separate realities, coexisting in the same space-time. The splitting apart of these two realities is inevitable. The only question is, how will it happen? We already see people leaving thanks to the sequelae of the COVID bioweapon jab. But this may only be the beginning. It takes about 2 years, on average, for citizens in the United States of America to recognize they are being poisoned, for captured regulatory agencies to make some token, inadequate attempt to fix the problem. It has taken longer with COVID in part due to the fact few who allowed themselves to get jabbed are willing to admit to themselves that they willingly may have signed their own death warrants. Now, who captured most of these agencies that are meant to regulate and protect? Well, the obvious answer is Big Pharma. Nothing new and no big surprise. Agencies developed mercantile relationships with the very companies they were supposed to be regulating. Kind of an economic Stockholm syndrome. Pharma cares about one thing: profits, and we have let this psychopathic entity run policy in multiple countries. Yet, does someone control Big Pharma like the military? Or is it Big Pharma that is in control of the military? Maybe they just work hand in hand, because what we saw take place in the last few years is a globalist military-run operation where everyone seemed to be controlled by a central source, even though the population was kept in the dark. Operation Lockstep, anyone? After all, you just don't announce there has been a biomilitary coup of the US government, along with many other countries, and expect the population will be okay with that. When it came to COVID, the FDA, the Federal Drug Administration, was MIA. The Centers for Disease Control was but rubber stamping, because on a practical level there was no more CDC. They became the propaganda arm of pharma, prevaricating their dark little hearts out to the public. The CDC's Vaccine Advisory Committee was completely compromised. The FDA existed in name only when it came to COVID. It was all a military operation, perhaps in cooperation with China's Fifth Column War to take down the USA. The CDC actually had the public relations firm for Pfizer and Moderna embed themselves inside the CDC. The CDC is a regulatory agency. It is not supposed to be marketing the very things they are supposed to be regulating. But then, they have been doing just that for all vaccines for decades, and few complained. You never have the same entity in charge of promoting, distributing vaccines, also be in charge of safety. That is a recipe for disaster. The CDC even owns patents on many of the vaccines. No conflict of interest there, eh? It was an out-in-the-open fact that the NIH was funding gain-of-function research at the Wuhan lab. Back in 2015, a paper was published titled "A SARS-like cluster of circulation bat coronaviruses shows potential for human emergence." This study clearly states that the authors conducted gain-of-function research on bat coronaviruses in order to make them infectious to primary human airway epithelial cells. Ralph Barrick from the University of North Carolina and his colleague Zhengli Li Shi were very much engineering the CoV-2 virus in Wuhan to make sure that virus was highly infectious to humans. So, literally everything that came out of Fauci's mouth and the rest of the government was just gaslighting. Western civilization was targeted for destruction and subjected to an intense propaganda campaign to create a permanent global government. But beneath the psyop was a spiritual war. Not being tangential here, but one can't ignore these macro disease issues, the spiritual sickness component of all this, and expect to understand the micro disease issues, like how does one deal with the myocarditis the bioweapon causes. Part of this spiritual war is to destroy the experiment called the USA, a constitutional republic where rights were given by God. That doesn't work for the imperialistic New World Order group. The USA was always the thorn in their side and had to be destroyed. And honestly, they got very far along in doing so. Maybe too far. Gates and Zuckerberg have poured in millions upon millions into the public education system in the USA, but students have only been getting dumber and dumber, so one has to assume all that money was not to improve education, but to destroy it. You don't want your future slaves to be educated. Indoctrinated, absolutely, but not educated. The dumbing down of Americans was by design. Nature, the creative spark of life, is just an anathema to this group of misanthropes who pretend they care about the environment. To them, we are just useless eaters and bottom feeders to be exploited and killed. But humanity has to know the enemy to end this. If we don't face this head on, then pharma will take over the world. And will make sure, for example, you can't travel if you are over 14 and not taking a statin drug, assuming you haven't been culled already. It was easy to lose faith in humanity when it was so obvious millions were being encouraged to illegally come to the USA, weaponized immigration, and bring one of the bioweapons being used to destroy us from the inside. Not CoV-2, but fentanyl. Because journalists, the legacy press, was captured and carried water for these enemies and traitors, the fail-safe that would have prevented all this was removed. Without the media, CoV-2 would have just been another flu-like illness that primarily affected the elderly and those with multiple comorbidities. Remember how the flu completely disappeared in 2020? The media truly was the virus, and also made sure you didn't know the USA was being invaded as policy. Globalist United Nations policy. Yet, the flu never disappeared. It was just called COVID to juice the numbers in a case-demic extraordinaire. With PCR tests cycled so high, even clean swabs would be positive. We actually saw our hospitals become de facto euthanasia factories, inappropriately putting patients on ventilators and pumping them full of the deadly drug remdesivir, what nurses called "run your death is near." I always wondered if all the videos of dancing nurses was their way of telling the public that hospitals were not being overwhelmed with COVID patients. But there was no science supporting the use of remdesivir, and it was well known as a deadly drug that was killing Ebola victims in a drug trial, and its use was halted. But the regulatory gatekeepers were all compromised, fired, or had resigned in disgust. The hospitals received a 20% payment bonus if they used the drug. A $500,000 hospital bill would generate an extra $150,000 if remdesivir was used. Putting a patient on a ventilator earned the hospital $40,000. That's a lot of money to help hospitals make choices about priorities. Wink, wink. Media organizations played a central role, especially big tech IT companies, in stifling anything that wasn't the approved narrative. Mainstream scientists, many leading experts in their field, working in prestigious institutions, and some medical journal editors themselves were all silenced while others were paid off. Where was all the billions coming from to create fabricated research critical of effective early interventions such as hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin? How much did the New England Journal of Medicine and Lancet get from FTX, the criminal crypto group, to publish articles so obviously flawed they would have been the cause of expulsion from any academic center that still had any integrity? FTX was critical in funding the attacks on effective early interventions, with the resultant loss of life. FTX, backed by elite investors like BlackRock, yeah, that's the Rockefeller Foundation, and Sequoia Capital, quickly became one of the largest crypto exchanges in the world. But behind the scenes, they were laundering and stealing investor funds to bankroll the neocon proxy war in Ukraine and, well, the Democrat Party, just to name two of their pet projects. Laundering money to the right people, Bankman-Fried had Wall Street and the media in his pocket while he practiced what he called effective altruism, which, honestly, was just deceit that made him look like a moral leader. But, it was just another Ponzi scheme funding the favorite New World Order players. And, believe it or not, it all happened right out in the open. Bankman-Fried's mother, apparently, was responsible for running major voter harvesting operations in the 2020 election, so the FTX group was a critical component of a fraudulent government and really its fraudulent economy. Yet, maybe FTX's implosion was all part of a bigger scam to allow a centrally controlled digital currency to rise to the surface. I won't even bring up the USAID financial improprieties. Wonder why it was so important to keep the conflict in Ukraine going, with no efforts at peace negotiations. Yeah, it was a money laundering operation, and they never wanted it to end, even if the end was an all-out nuclear holocaust. Few people knew Ukraine was the playground for the New World Order Dark Ones. The local population didn't know any more than USA citizens knew. Their country is actually the headquarters of the Dark Ones, and that our constitutional republic vanished years ago. Drug trafficking, sex trade, organ harvesting, all of that was taking place in Ukraine without any interference until the Russian invasion. Just an aside, don't invest with anyone who looks and smells like they can't afford a bar of soap. Decades of pandemic preparedness protocols were just thrown out the window so a psychotic, pipsqueak criminal mastermind could enrich himself and his loyal following. Loyal because, well, he controlled their NIH grants. It seems, based on the Freedom of Information documents, that Fauci may have actually been telling the CIA what to do, not the other way around. We were literally in the middle of a Godfather movie, but it wasn't Don Corleone calling the shots. It was dog torturer, vivisectionist, foster children murderer, Mr. I am the science himself. There was actually some truth to that statement because, this one man was literally the point man for distributing tens of billions of dollars to academic and research institutions throughout the world. So he had almost complete control of the science. This was a very dark, pernicious situation. For example, if a research team finds out that it's very dangerous to inject vaccines that contain aluminum, 80% of vaccines contain aluminum, that research team will be defunded and journals will be told not to print their research papers. Let us not forget that 86% of the world was shut down for an infection that had a 0.035% mortality from 0 to 59 years of age and 0.095% mortality for the post-60 set. If you are younger than 20, the fatality rate was 0.0003%. Clearly, this is below fatality rates from the flu, and yet this was the emergency that allowed them to bypass safety studies and force or coerce people to get experimental injections that had never been used before, and then lie about what they would do. They even lied about saying the vaccine would prevent transmission and infection, and of course, was safe and effective, as they say all vaccines are. Safe and effective became an indoctrination mantra. Most vaccines do not have adequate safety studies, despite what we have all been led to believe. This wasn't just regulatory malfeasance. This was about trashing the U.S. Constitution, and honestly, murdering as many as possible. The median and mean age of death from COVID holds steady at 82 years of age. 70% of the mortality in the USA were in the elderly, with 6 or more underlying medical conditions. If it were not going to be COVID, it would have been something else, as they were already beyond the average life expectancy. Over the last 3 years, no healthy child in the USA died from a CoV-2 infection. Not a single healthy child. Well, we weren't supposed to be alive to discuss any of this, but the criminal reset plan failed right out of the starting gate because CoV-2 was supposed to have killed billions, and the jab was supposed to finish off as many survivors as possible. Too many people were left alive, asking inconvenient questions. One of the few true responsibilities of a government is to protect the integrity of the nation's border. But the so-called open border was intended to bring in a replacement population. Vote for candidates from the Democrat Party, and furthermore, the rest of us were supposed to be already dead, or dying anyway. If you can't define the enemy, you can't defeat your enemy. One of the things that makes fleshing out these events important is, well, medicine as we have known it just won't survive. The population is losing, and will soon lose completely, any trust in public health institutions and modern medicine in general. And honestly, that trust won't be coming back anytime soon, nor should it. Evidence-based medicine was destroyed during the last few years, and public health decisions were being made on plausibility. Like, how much money is it plausible to make if we force deadly injections on the public that don't even work and lock them down? Modern medicine decided to follow a dark agenda and became a dark influence. While COVID may have been a Hail Mary for the dying paradigm of the bio-military pharmaceutical complex, in order to maintain control, it still caused a lot of death and suffering. They will try and regroup if we don't all wake up. If the USA has a major financial collapse, perhaps the money to fund many of these shenanigans just won't be there to fuel the murder. The lockdown fetishism imposed on us was an import from China as part of their fifth column attack to destroy our economy. But it was also the agenda of the NWO and WEF set. Human history has been replete with invasions, attacks, trade wars, and so on. It seems like raging war on each other was chosen to be the primary operational paradigm on this planet. For the most part, they were driven by the need to eat, have land to grow food, trade routes, things like that. I am not assigning blame, and after all, it was the crucible of our modern civilization, which I have to say has not turned out so well. Today, war is machine, unending on anything and everything, be it COVID, drugs, terrorism, Afghanistan, Ukraine, Syria, Iran. It doesn't matter. The population is never told the real reasons for war, which is to wash money out of our hands and into the hands of this group of dark elites. So, war is never over. There is always another, and it never stops. Alexander the Great wanted to take over the world, but even he wouldn't recognize modern war, even though he was a one-man wrecking crew. Even the Roman Empire was less about cruelty, power, and greed than what humankind now experiences. In the 13th century CE, the Mongol horde pieced together the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen, and, unlike the plethora of wars that preceded it, this was being driven by a level of power, cruelty, brutality without honor, and greed never seen before. Energetically, Earth was being beset upon by a dark energy that was not homegrown. It was only present because there were enough humans who held these negative traits for this energy to become interested in feeding off of them and the havoc they could reap with encouragement. The generation of fear is key to its survival or presence on this planet. Fear, which is the opposite of love, is the gasoline this dark force runs on. What does any of this ancient esoterica have to do with what we are experiencing today? Where the USA government, the largest empire in modern times, has become vicious, incompetent, utterly corrupt, and under the control of agendas pushed from elsewhere. They know they're lying. We know they're lying. They know we know they're lying. The southern border of the USA was in full operational control by traitors inside the USA, and that control was to keep the border wide open and lie about it. It was a weaponized invasion. The American people didn't understand their country had been taken over. Since it seems politicians lie and can't stop themselves from lying, the public lost the ability to know big lies from small lies. Call it some kind of desensitization. But it produced an apathy that only empowered the cabal. Institutionalized lying is a major factor that enables liars-in-chief to carry out their illegal, immoral, and criminal practices of institutionalized discrimination, retaliation, defamation, and intellectual harassment. Deception is the modus operandi of the Dark Ones, which is why free speech had to be eliminated in their playbook. Puppets are never told the true reasons for doing what they are doing. Only the upper tier of puppets are made privy to some of this information. For example, the CIA hitman who murdered Marilyn Monroe was told she was sleeping with Castro and leaking to him things JFK had whispered to her under the sheets. Norman Hodges said he carried out 37 assassinations for the USA between 1959 and 1972. Jumping ahead in this story, to address one of the top puppets, Peter Daszak, who is a perfect example of how this dark energy turns the like-minded into its puppets. Can you believe that a scientist funded by the United States government could possibly create a virus on purpose to release it and then hype up a resulting infectious disease crisis, all for profit and power? Daszak's EcoHealth Alliance was essentially a front group for a faction of the CIA and DARPA. Daszak reiterated that until an infectious disease crisis is very real, present, and at an emergency threshold, it is often largely ignored. To sustain the funding base beyond the crisis, he said, we need to increase public understanding of the need for MCM's medical countermeasures, such as a pan-influenza or pan-coronavirus vaccine. A key driver is the media, and the economics follow the hype. We need to use that hype to our advantage to get to the real issues. Investors will respond if they see profit at the end of process, Daszak stated. The above paragraph is from page 73 of Rapid Medical Countermeasure Response to Infectious Diseases, Enabling Sustainable Capabilities through Ongoing Public and Private Sector Partnerships, published by the National Academy of Sciences in 2016. How did we get here? We know so little about the true history of mankind on this planet. The great civilizations that have waxed and waned long before recorded modern history. Regardless of the time or place, oligarchs of the civilizations that we do know about have been obsessed with overpopulation, going back to at least the days of Plato and Aristotle. While there are some areas on the planet that have too many humans in the same space or in the wrong place. Overpopulation itself is a myth, perpetuated to help the ruling class maintain control. It is about wealth transfer. Even though most of humanity is not aware of the full extent of what has been going on, open war has been declared by those who want to repress and command with the purpose of keeping the rest of us unconscious, keeping us from being inquiring beings, keeping us from knowing how strong the human spirit is, or exploring what we are capable of becoming. This is the emotional grid they want to impose. They want to keep us small, controlled, so they can feed off of our assets and energies. They are literally deranged fools whose minds have been warped by their greed and the covenant they have made with forces that have always lied to them and continue to lie to them. This struggle is not new and is addressed in fable and parable by many of the world's ancient texts, but this is not speculation of what has happened in the far past. This is about what is happening now and why. Lose your spirit and you have lost everything. Lionel Richie. It is problematic that humans think they are nothing more than evolved mammalian primates, or apes. Yes, those are the bodies we use. But we are spiritual beings having a human experience, not just naked apes that aspire to be spiritual. Spirit is not the enthusiasm you have for your local high school football team. It would behoove us all to try and understand what spirit is, because there have been those trying to kill you for having one. There are juicy energies and powers connected with being human, a subject humans are almost completely unaware of. However, there are those who know about these hidden features of the human experience and want those energies and powers for themselves. Without belaboring the point, tyranny can only be imposed if the population believes they are nothing more than their animal bodies, limited to their five senses. Tyranny runs on fear, and it is much harder to scare someone who is not completely tied to what their five senses tell them reality is all about. Tyranny cannot exist where there is freedom of speech, so it is really easy to tell who the bad guys are. They censor and don't want freedom of speech. In a timeline that starts in 1933, although the darkness got its foothold long before that, a group of bankers hatched a plot to replace U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt with someone who was more in line with these entrenched institutions and the systemic ideologies that do not want democracies to exist. These dark ones were still drunk on their success from being able to create the Federal Reserve. There was no coup d'etat because their point man, retired Marine Corps General Smedley Butler, betrayed them. So the banking cabal shifted all their attention to Germany. That same year, the Public Health Service of the USA began its infamous Tuskegee experiment on poor black males in Alabama. An experiment that lasted 40 years and only ended in 1972 because of a leak to the press. Under the guise of receiving free health care, the victims were watched to see what the ravages of syphilis would do to them and their families. No Nuremberg trial held, no accountability, but if you are an American apparently, it's okay to say you were just following orders if caught, and it's all mea culpa and asking for amnesty. The lessons of the last century have not been completely understood, and now humanity is in that awkward place where there is a reckoning with these poorly understood experiences that have been swept under the rug. However, the rug is now gone, and it would behoove the world to recognize the players of our immediate past for who they really were. For example, Adolf Hitler was probably the greatest teacher of hate the 20th century had ever seen. Intolerance was intense in the Western world a century ago, and he filled the calling others had prepared for someone with this intention and influence. He had other options for his life, which he closed down early. Bringing up Hitler, or suggesting we are unduly influenced by energies we can't perceive, many will just tune out. But honestly, that's merely a reflection of how indoctrinated we have all become. Indoctrinated by negative energies that have kept us trapped for millennia in deception, delusion, fear, and wars. And part of that indoctrination was to convince us we were powerless to change any of this. Rather sad that the megalomaniac leading this was again a German national, Klaus Schwab. One would have thought we were done with that part of our history. In one sentence, this is what World War II was about. Hitler, like Schwab, was merely a tool for large international corporations and banks that were funding him to implement a top-down feudal economy in Europe that would hopefully expand worldwide and reign for 1,000 years, or as long as they had the slaves to feed into the system. Yet their tool became too unstable, too unpredictable, and too uncontrollable as he tried to take over the entire planet. The globalists were still able to use him as a pretext for the NATO and European Union paradigm to control Europe. Now, with both the inspiration for Hitler and much of his financial support coming from inside the United States, it was no surprise that Operation Paperclip brought so many Nazi scientists and technocrats to the United States after the Kinetic War was completed. About 30,000 Nazis. The American Nazis, although they did not call themselves Nazis, brought their assets back, while Hitler himself, a dilettante compared to the fools who have made war against us today, was allowed to retire to South America. The eugenicists in America, and to some extent England, were a great influence and inspiration to the Nazi regime. And in fact, it was a part of the defense used in the Nuremberg trials to justify the programs they implemented. But there were other influencers as well, and honestly, they may still be present today. The upper tier of Nazism were deeply into the dark side of occult esoterica. The swastika itself was an ancient symbol of the universe. So what the Nazis did was use that symbol, rotating to the left, or counterclockwise. A symbol of a devolving universe, not an evolving universe, shown when it rotates to the right. This symbol drew in those worldwide who knew what it meant, rotating counterclockwise, which is why, for example, dead Tibetans were reported to have been found among the casualties in World War II. Sorcerers, perhaps enlisted to help with dark rituals. Rituals are really important to the puppets of darkness, as it provides them with a sense of power. They are now flaunting some of their rituals in the open, just to name three: the weird closing Olympic ceremony in London, 2012, which heralded a plague that would put many in hospital. In late 2021, the rapper Travis Scott's Astroworld performance was not only overtly satanic, but murders, human sacrifices perhaps, took place during the performance. In 2022, the overtly satanic advertisements of Balenciaga, it would surprise many to find out just who these puppets of darkness have been, and currently are. For example, Madeleine Albright, former Secretary of State, was celebrated when she passed in 2022. Despite being a mass murderer, she publicly announced the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq that killed over 500,000 children were worth it. Researchers who has attended the ceremonies at Bohemian Grove in Northern California where they worship the false deity Moloch, and you may be surprised. Then there is the Bilderberg and Davos group and their high priests, that is literally what they call themselves, a smarmier group of international corporate scum and villainy you will never find. The World Economic Forum is just a front group for these power-crazed psychopaths who draw into their circle those who are in sync with them, the law of attraction, and they may not all be human, which is almost a guarantee. Consider the possibility that we are part of a universe replete with life and intelligences of all types and stripes, be they seen or unseen, trillions upon trillions of conscious beings to a greater or lesser degree. It is regrettable that humans are so unaware and so misinformed about our participation in the cosmos, and we are even less aware of non-humans in the affairs of our lives and our planet. Some seem to be divinely angelic. Some are more like predatory parasites. As questionable as the influence of these low vibrational others might be, they probably weren't responsible for the descent of certain governments into satanic, murderous, pedophile networks used to control and manipulate those that entered the halls of power. Pedophilia is the sick glue that holds their system together. The Dark Ones know children, especially young children, are closer to source, and by defiling them, by being brutal and cruel, one is showing God that you are a contrarian, an angry contrarian. Why would you want to show God you are an angry contrarian? Seems counterintuitive, but foolish humans believe the promises made to them about personal power and wealth. So for the weak-minded, that apparently is all it takes, and unfortunately there are many with weak minds. This is beyond mere corruption. World governments had been bled out from the inside by these global predators. In fact, international banks, working with Pfizer, successfully executed a planetary coup against the nation-state. Pfizer is the most criminally fined corporation in America that admitted in front of the European Union that they never tested the COVID injection to see if it would stop transmission or infection. Of course, now we know it doesn't. One of the predators, who actually was and may never have stopped being a Nazi, is global financier and convicted felon George Soros. His plan, which is shared by many in these elite circles, was to shut down every part of the economy in the First World and deindustrialize the United States. The collapsing borders, superinflation, total elimination of fossil fuels, unless it comes from perhaps British Petroleum or those in league with the globalists, and collapse of the world food supply, mass starvation. All this so a corporate United Nations coordinated world government can come in and act as saviors. This is the end of part 1.